Awesome. All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dev DeVrat. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm an associate dean of admission here at Reed College. Really excited to be here with you all today to talk a little bit more about both of two different programs, our comparative literature program as well as our German program. And so excited to be here with you all in this session, and I encourage you to ask your questions. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our faculty member to introduce themselves and then tell us a little bit about their programs. And then we'll jump right into some of your questions.
Hi, so welcome. My name is Jan Mieszkowski. And of course, if you come to read, as everybody here uses first names, you would just casually address me as Jan, even if you didn't know me. And I'm here today to talk, really to answer any questions you have about both the comparative literature program and the German program. And I'm just going to give you a brief outline of what they are. But I know from experience, it can be sometimes hard for me to anticipate what you do and don't know about these things. So it's always more efficient if you simply ask the questions you want me to answer. So, as you know, or maybe as you might imagine, we have at Reed an English department, and then we have a number of foreign language and literature departments, and then we have a comparative literature program. And basically, the comparative literature program is organized around the notion that to study literature, you don't necessarily have to study a national tradition. So, English department, you do English language literature, French department, you do French literature, German department, you do German literature. Comparative literature says, all right, we're studying literature, but we're not organizing it around these national principles. And what that means is that it tends to be a lot more international, sort of more transnational. It also tends to be sometimes sort of a very theoretical area of study, and it tends to be interdisciplinary. So we have students doing, and the other thing about comparative literature is you have some basic core requirements, but you have a huge amount of freedom in terms of creating your own program of study and ultimately shaping the topic that will be the core of your thesis. So comparative literature is obviously in dialogue with or is part of the sort of larger literature structure at the college. But it's compared to an English major or a German major, say, it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of how you craft the study. I'm also just coincidentally, in addition to being the chair of Comp Lit this year, I'm also the chair of the German department. And the German department is, again, as the name sounds, somewhat more traditionally organized around the study of German literature and initially German language. But the German department is also sort of your conduit to study abroad in German speaking countries. One thing you probably know from the website is that Reed has ever expanding resources when it comes to study abroad. And we have, particularly in German, we have amazing programs that you can go on whatever level of language you're at. So even if you came to Reed and you weren't even that interested in studying German literature or something like that, but you thought, well, when I'm a sophomore, I want to spend a semester in Berlin, that would be no problem. Um, I think I'm actually just going to stop there, but please ask any questions, starting with the most basic things, like if you just want to know why is studying literature different than how you study it when you're a junior in high school, we can talk about that. But really, as I said, I'm at your disposal, so anything you want to throw our direction would be great.
Awesome. Thank you, Jan. As the students are thinking of questions to ask you to put in the chat box, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the thesis process for both departments, Comp Lit and German. And so for those of you that are not aware, there is a thesis requirement here at Reed where all seniors write or do a thesis project of some sort in their final year. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what that thesis process looks like. How do you go about advising students? What are examples of some theses that have been done by students in both programs?
Sure. So the important thing to understand about the thesis project is it is a year-long project, and it's something that the student does in very close collaboration with their faculty advisor. And that means this ends up being a really substantial piece of work. So normally when I show a senior thesis written by a Reed student to colleagues at other institutions, to them, it looks more like a master's thesis. It looks like something done at the graduate level because it's just such an intense project. The other thing, and this is sort of a hallmark of Reed in general, is students have an enormous amount of autonomy when it comes to picking their own topic. So if you were a German major, obviously you'd be picking a topic that had something to do with German language, literature, history, and culture. But within that broad domain, the specifics of what you ultimately want to concentrate on are entirely left up to you. And obviously, to some extent, one works this topic out with an advisor, particularly in the first semester. You're sort of groping forward. You give the research project, parameters, you give shape to it, and so forth. But it's really driven by the students. And the most interesting theses that I've advised have almost invariably been very interesting because of the creativity of the students. That's something I always tell people about Reed students. They are very creative. They have a lot of sort of intellectual fortitude, and it really shows in the work. But the thesis process begins, as I said, in a kind of exploratory way. So you start in the first semester really just testing out ideas, reading texts with your advisor, talking about possible routes of inquiry, sort of feeling your way forward. And at the end of that culminates then at the end of the semester in a single chapter, which is sort of the first draft of a chapter of the thesis. And you then present that chapter or you discuss that chapter with two faculty members, your advisor and another faculty member. And that's sort of a way at the halfway point to take stock of where you're going, what you're planning, does this seem feasible, and so forth. And then in the second semester, this is when the bulk of the writing gets done. Everything has to be sort of ironed out, nailed down, and whatnot. But the process culminates then when you've written the entire thesis and submitted it, you actually have an oral defense of the thesis for like a 90-minute defense in front of typically four faculty members. And again, this is a very hallowed rite of passage at Reed College. If you meet somebody who's 80 years old who went to Reed, I can promise you they could narrate their thesis oral minute by minute, blow by blow. It's not something you ever forget. And in fact, this is not fiction. This has actually happened. I ran into someone in a grocery store the other day who graduated from Reed in 2010. And he said, "Oh, yes, I remember you. You're a professor." And without any prompting, he started talking about his senior thesis, even though it was like in math or something. It had nothing to do with me. But it's such an essential cornerstone of what happens at Reed. And that's kind of exciting. In terms of theses that I've advised, recently, for example, I had a student who wrote a thesis about three contemporary poets. They're all actually, these were English language poets. He was doing this in comparative literature. Um, but yeah, that's what he wrote. And it was an extremely successful document. In fact, he then applied to graduate school and was admitted to this whole slew of graduate school programs, largely, I think, on the basis of the quality of that work. And that's another thing is if you're interested in going on and doing graduate work, one of the nice things about the thesis is a certain kind of currency in that, you can send that in as a writing sample, and it really constitutes a very mature piece of scholarship typically. Another thesis I'm advising right now, the student is actually writing about theories of photography and how they relate to certain arguments in poetics. So she's sort of writing about theories of poetry and theories of photography. And right now she's finishing a chapter, interestingly, on the history of the flash. So I know something about the history of photography. I, had read or had been in the area. I'd never heard anyone discuss the history of flash photography. But this was, again, something entirely of her own initiative. She sort of seized on this as being a really interesting problem, and has persuaded me that it is. So those are just examples of the thesis. But yeah, I mean, more or less from the moment you get to Reed in a funny way, they start preparing you for the day when you will be doing the thesis. So it's kind of an exciting trajectory.
Yeah, thank you. And we've got some samples of theses in our admissions office too. We've got, I mean, two massive shelves full of admission interns, former admission interns, copies of their thesis. So if you're ever at Reed and doing a visit, there's plenty of samples for you to look at. I was wondering if you can talk to us. I got a private message about the advising process at Reed, outside of just the thesis advising. What is a general advising? How does that work at Reed? When do we start those conversations, and what do those look like?
Sure. So you are assigned, when you're an incoming student, you're assigned an advisor with whom you will meet before classes start. And normally that's been the week, sort of during orientation week, the week right before the semester begins. But there is some discussion that may even be moved earlier. So you may meet potentially with your advisor via Zoom sometime even in the middle of August. It's sort of still up in the air. But the advisor is normally somebody who's in some way affiliated with what you think you might be majoring in. And of course, this is very speculative. And I should assure you that nobody expects when you come into college on day one that you absolutely positively know what your major is going to be. You may have some ideas. They may turn out to be right, or they may turn out to be totally wrong. Because one thing you'll learn very quickly is, study of topics in college in many ways does not correspond to studying the same topics in high school. So what you thought was maybe your favorite thing in high school may suddenly turn out not to be, and vice versa. Something you loathed in high school, you may suddenly realize it's fascinating. So there's no threat. There's no imperative that you know immediately what your major is going to be. In any case, you meet with your advisor before classes start, and they have a certain amount of information. They see your application materials, so they know what you did in high school. They know what your interests are. You write a little letter to them in the summer, dear advisor, this is what I'd like you to know about me, this sort of thing. And then you meet, and it's partly a get to know you session, and it's partly talking about your ideas for classes, trying to sort of start, making a schedule for the first year. But it's also the advisor really is a resource for you in the institution. They're not an authority figure. They're not there to judge you. And that means they can answer whatever questions you have that they know the answers to, mostly academic questions, questions about the curriculum and so forth. But then they also know who will know the answers to your other questions. So quite often my role as an advisor is not answering the student's questions, but telling the student, well, the person who will know the answer to that question is this, or let me ask that person. But there, again, the advisor in some ways is a kind of jack of all trades. I mean, they're really there to facilitate your sort of smooth integration into the community. And it sort of varies a little bit. Some people will stay with the same advisor the whole 4 years, particularly depending on what their major ultimately is. Other people might switch advisors at a certain point. Again, there's flexibility there. It partly depends on what you decide to study.
Thank you. And can you walk us through, like, do both of these programs have a structured um, path in order to get to their to that end, the end goal of graduating? Is there some flexibility in the courses?
And here we actually have a nice question in the chat, which is about this. Um, Major requirements, specific required courses. Yes. All right. Here, sure. I'll talk about Complit first, and then I can also talk about German. So the way Complit works is you have there is an introductory course, Introduction to Comparative Literature, and that's a required course. That's sort of your first course in the major. A lot of students, interestingly, take this in their first year. So we've had increasingly um, a lot of students coming in saying they want to major in Complit. When we offer this Intro to Complit course, it frequently has a good cohort of first year students who are in it. That course is really, an introduction to the discipline, an introduction in a sense to all the different ways of thinking about studying literature, really. And it's a very popular class. And it's, by nature, the canon is very international. Um, and this is so to some degree transdisciplinary. Now, what you then go on to do in Complit um, depends a little bit. There's basically two tracks. So one track is just exclusively a literature track, and that means you will do 8 upper level or sort of middle and upper level literature courses. But there's also the opportunity to do what's called an allied field. And what that means is you're interested in a certain topic that maybe pertains to literature and anthropology or literature and history or literature. We've had people do literature and computer science, believe it or not. And the key thing in Comp Lit is you ultimately are coming up with the concept for how these courses fit together. And if you, maybe I should put it in the chat actually, because it's sometimes the web is helpful. If I let's see here. Yeah. Um, I'm going to put this in the chat. This is from the website of the comparative literature major. And what that specifically does, if you go there, you'll see it describe something called major proposal. And what that is in your junior year, you basically write a one-page description of your course of study. And what's nice, I sent you this link because it actually has two examples, two samples of what that would look like. So the first one, the student is saying they're going to study the rise of the novel in early modern France and Spain. And they describe how they're going to do that. And then the second one is interdisciplinary track, and they say they want to explore the role of Marxism in 20th century literary studies. And what they do in that proposal then is they list all the courses that will go with that. Um, and they also give an explanation for why they need to do this in comparative literature. In other words, why couldn't you just do that in the English department or the French department or the Spanish department, something like that. Um, so as you see, like there's a lot of flexibility with comparative literature in terms of what courses you exactly do. But at the same time, that's also to say there's a certain onus on you to, come up with a guiding concept. The other required course for comparative literature, you need to take an intro to literary theory course, in addition to then the 6 to 8 English, 6 to 8 literature courses. And then, of course, you write the senior thesis. In terms of the kinds of courses we offer, I mean, I think the best thing I could tell you is to browse the catalog. We offer so many different kinds of courses. I'll just tell you a few I teach, but again, this is just a smattering. I mean, the offerings, if you just go through all the different literature departments, and I would say like most of the courses that you would do in Comp Lit would of course be given in another department. So go look at the English department website, the French department, the German department, and so forth. You'll see the whole range. But just a couple seminars I've taught recently. So I'm currently this semester. It's really more of it's sort of a philosophy of aesthetics course that I'm teaching, that has a lot of continental, mostly German philosophers who've been very influential for literary studies. And this is a really popular class because there's a lot of students who want to do this kind of philosophy and they don't get a lot of chances to do it. A course I taught last semester is something called Plants and Politics. And it was about the poetics of botany. So it sort of starts with this basic observation that poets have always been obsessed with flowers. And this seems like a trivial observation, but then we sort of ask ourselves, well, what is the interest in that? Why do flowers have such a purchase on the poetic imagination? And so we look at a lot of people who both write texts, literary texts that are a lot about flora. But there's been a lot of people who've written about this problem, about, in what ways literature has things to teach us about the environment, about ecology. And a certain component of this relates to very contemporary problems in environmental studies. So a lot of students in that class are actually environmental studies students. And a lot of the work a certain amount of literature we read is about now is certainly it's about climate change. So that's an example of a class I did. I have a colleague who teaches a lot of media studies courses. He taught, for example, I forget how it was called. It was something like, a course about robots and automatons. And it was basically about the idea of sort of mechanicity in literary texts. He taught a course like that. There's large film offerings. And I should also say, we do have a film and media studies program. So that media studies may not mean a lot to you now, but certainly film studies, you have the general idea. That is that's a program with very popular classes. Um, so those are just some examples. Let me see here. More questions. In conflict, can you compare literature from any two cultures? Absolutely. So it's not so much that you'd say, all right, I'm going to take the Russian novel and the Spanish novel and compare them. It's more, I want to look at a certain problem, but it's a problem that crosses these national borders. And so then, sure, you could do a comparative study that would involve Russian and Spanish. You could do, I mean, people have done also, French and Vietnamese. Um, I think someone, people have done, like German and Japanese, German and Chinese. I mean, there's all sorts of different things depending on the topic. And often you'll find sometimes some of these things you might think it's a stretch, but often you'll find that these national traditions actually have a lot of communication between them. That a lot of Germans at various points were reading a lot of Japanese literature and vice versa. So there's that these things are often more connected than the globe might have you think, the geography might have you think. But yeah, absolutely. You can put together any sort of constellation of things. And it doesn't have to be across languages. As I think I just mentioned, one of my students was working primarily on contemporary English language poets. That was the nature of his project. Um, the next question was how many languages out? You need to have the ability to do upper level work in at least one language besides English. So just one other language. So that means you can take upper level literature courses in that language. Um, I think that was it. Other questions?
Great, thank you so much. You touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can maybe elaborate a little bit more on what are the research opportunities look like in both programs outside of the thesis? Is that something that happens often? Do students do this alongside professors? Is this more of a solo thing? Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. So, in terms of, I mean, what often students are interested in is summer research. That's often, the thing that comes up. Sometimes even before they get here, they're writing, can we do summer research? And it really depends on, to some extent, it depends on language skills. So, for instance, there are often translation opportunities that are a form of research that people take advantage of depending if they come with more advanced language skills. But usually it's a question of finding a professor who's working on a project, just as it would be in the sciences or the social sciences, where you might, be able to do something to have something to contribute. So for example, in the past, there was one year I was redesigning a course I had that it was primarily actually a gender studies course, and I was redesigning it, and I was interested in a lot of contemporary scholarship on certain topics. And so I employed a student over the summer who just did a lot of research, read a lot of journal articles and sort of summarized a lot of materials for me. And so that's something. There are also much more elaborate grants that you can get for collaborative work in the humanities. And this is probably not something you do right away, but more like after your junior year, say where you and a faculty member get a substantial sum of money, actually, to basically work on a project together over the summer. And in those cases, you're not the assistant to the professor. The idea is you're both you're both partners in this project. And the intent is that what you produce is actually a publishable article. And that happens on a regular basis. I mean, 5 or 6 of those happen every summer, and the results are often quite remarkable. But it really is truly collaborative work there. So you're not playing, you're not second fiddle to anybody, as it were. You're really true collaborator in that sense. Um, so yeah, those are some options. I think, does that cover it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And I think that's your answer was a really good segue into this next question, which is, can you talk a little bit more about what does just overall community look like in these departments? I've done a few of these virtual sessions with a few other departments, and they talk about sort of what does that culture in that program look like? I'm wondering if you can maybe elaborate a little bit more on
Right,
that.
right. Well, all of the foreign language departments have language dorms, right? So French, Spanish, Chinese, German, Russian. And what that means is depending on your level of language, you can you can apply to live in that dorm. And the intent is when you're in that dorm, you will only speak the target language. And so those places tend to sort of be the hubs on campus for the cultural events. So the German language dorm, we call it a German house. Our German dorm, they have film series, they have sort of coffee hours, they have various activities, they throw various kinds of parties and so forth. But the key thing is, yeah, it's all sort of organized around that space where a certain number of people are actually living. It's actually their dorm. And the in terms of the literature programs, there isn't a natural home, or I should just say like a lounge. I mean, some departments have their own spaces where the students can actually just hang out. I guess classics actually has this. But there's not as much a space. Those spaces are more what goes on, as I say, in the language houses and those kinds of things. But the students, when you're in these majors, you take a lot of different classes with various people. You get to know the students. So, for example, like the seminar I'm teaching now, I guess there's 18 students in it. It's clear they've all been in classes with one another, and there's a real esprit de corps. They really feel often like a team. So, they've come there, they know each other, they socialize with one another, they've studied, they've learned a lot with one another, and it really shows in terms of how they can interact in the classroom and in the quality of the conversations. These are much richer conversations that we have in seminar, precisely because they have experience working with one another and so forth. So, and we also in Complit, we have party usually for faculty and students. There's a colleague who lives just literally a stone's throw from the campus, and she has this great house for parties, and we usually throw a couple parties every year there. And just hang out in her garden. So that, so there's a, sort of student faculty camaraderie there. There's one question up here is how many comp lit majors currently in comp lit overall in the program? I mean, I'm just looking this up. There's 31. Um, Now, you don't really know. I mean, some of those people may have declared it, you don't know if they will all finish, but we have, yeah, 8 to 10 seniors finishing a year. So this year we have 8 or 9, I think, who are finishing their thesis this spring. So that's about right. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
This
Another
is,
question, can a comp lit or a language major student, um, I'm going to actually expand this question. Can a comp lit, non-comp lit or language major student still dorm in the language housing?
oh,
And
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
oh, great, okay. And can students still take classes in either programs without that being their major?
Sure. So in terms of the language dorms, absolutely. Often the majority of people in those dorms are not majors in German or French, or I can't say to all the languages, but I'm trying to think that people are frankly that so that's another thing about community. The German dorm, for example, once a year they have a dinner for the faculty where they all cook, and I'm always amazed how they can cook so well. But they so we had this dinner, and I think the majority of students in the German house right now are bio or chem majors. They've all spent time in Germany, or some of them came from German speaking families, but yeah, they're mostly STEM actually in those dorms. I mean, that dorm right now anyway. That's not always the case, but that's the case now. In terms of classes, yes, most classes across all the literature programs and film and media studies, whatever, most of them are open to anyone. You can take them as electives, and people frequently do. I have first year students who take them. There is a question of getting in. Particularly some of these film classes are very popular and they will fill up very quickly. So that as a first year, it'd be a lot harder to get in than if you were a sophomore, junior, or senior. But most of these classes, not the ones that are obviously that are taught in the language, but most of these classes, particularly the comparative ones, are taught in English, and the prerequisite sometimes is Hum 110, so you couldn't do it your first year. But you could certainly, even if you weren't in any of these majors, you could certainly take these classes sophomore, junior, senior.
Great, thank you. And then I'm curious, what makes our programs, both the German and the Complet programs, different than programs across the country?
Well, I think so. The obvious thing is the difference between a liberal arts college and a university is obviously being in a much smaller program, you get a lot more attention. But that would be true at any liberal arts college. I think what makes our literature programs distinctive compared to other liberal arts colleges, um, I think we have a higher percentage of faculty who are very active in the field. Now, I'm sure maybe some of my colleagues at Williams or Swarthmore will argue with me, but I don't know. I might win the argument. In any case, the point is certainly there is a very high level of research engagement, which isn't the case. I could just say it's not the case at every liberal arts college, and I think that really shows in terms of the dynamism of the offerings, um, and also in terms of partly the quality of the teaching, but also the opportunities for to present students with different topics, with new kinds of paradigms and so forth. I mean, it's a dynamic, right? People aren't just stuck doing the same thing decade after decade, which is always a risk in academia. Even at the most hallowed places, there's a certain percentage of people who are just doing the same thing they've been doing for 40 years or whatever. There's not a lot of that goes on at Reed. And I'd say that that's not just in literature. I think one of the things that's really exciting about the Reed curriculum is it's a living thing. It's always changing. What's going on today is not what was going on 10 years ago, pretty much across the board. And I think that is distinctive about Reed. And that's partly also due to the institution, giving us the resources to have the time and the ability to do these things. But
Great, thank you. And I'm wondering, in terms of like outcomes for programs, where have you seen students go to after leaving Reed, graduating from these programs?
right. Well, one thing, and this is not something specific to Reed, but I have some friends in the profession at large who have sort of made it their mission to fight the misinformation about majoring in say English or Comp Lit or German or something like that. There's this notion floating around, not just in the media. Unfortunately, it seems to somehow get in the ear of high school guidance counselors that, well, you won't get a job if you major in the humanities or something like this. This is simply statistically not the case. If you look at expected earnings of people a few years out of college, yes, the average STEM major is probably making more money than the average humanities major. But move that 10 years out, 15 years out, it's the other way around. And I can give you examples. I mean, I remember, I just anecdotally, like people I know, like a friend of my sister's who was an English major in college. And then she went into industry, and now she's a manager, and 50 people who majored in CS work under her as coders, and it's not, but she's the boss, right? And one thing that's always made very clear, there are a lot of Reed alums who have businesses who hire in the Pacific Northwest area. So they're always interested in hiring new Reed graduates. And what they always say without fail is they say, the things we know about somebody, why you'd hire somebody from Reed, we know they've been taught to analyze and we know they can write. And that is really a ticket to working basically anywhere. I mean, there are very few. If you have analytic skills and you have the ability to write, there really aren't many doors that are closed to you. And as I said, people beyond our alumni network, I mean, just employers in general in the Portland area have always said, yes, they would hire, Reed graduates without hesitation, precisely because they know they're prepared with these kinds of skills that will translate into any field. So I would really, as I said, I would really discourage you from thinking, oh, the humanities is going to somehow disadvantage me in my career, my earning potentials. It's most cases, it's really the opposite. And again, as I say, there's a lot of media buzz that would try to convince you otherwise, but it's just not statistically borne out. So. And in terms of what they do, so just to give you specific examples, I mean, some will go on to do what people from many majors might do, like they might go to law school, or they might, a lot of them go into higher ed of various forms. Um, some go into publishing, some go into the various forms of the arts. So, some go into various media companies, or sometimes they go into journalism, things like that. And then a certain percentage want to go on and do some kind of graduate work. And not always necessarily in literature. I mean, sometimes people will, be an undergraduate literature major and then go do a master's in history, or, a PhD in political science. In other words, there's a certain amount of crossover. But that's normal as well. Some others, I mean, there's other options too, and this can often be financially expeditious. It's a In Europe, unlike in the United States, the federal governments truly support education. And what that means is it can be extremely cheap to study there, even as a foreigner. So sometimes we'll have people who will get Reed BAs, and then, for example, they'll go to Germany, they'll go to Austria or something like that, and they'll do work in universities there, sometimes for quite a long time. But partly because it's so inexpensive compared to what goes on in the US. So those are other options.
Great. Thank
Let me
you.
see. Hold on, we have some other things. Da, 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 da. Besides the require intro to complet classes, are there any other specific class requirements? Okay, so no. The only other requirement is you need an intro to lit theory course. And yeah, that's basically the only requirement for comp lit. Then beyond that, you can take whatever sort of field of classes you want. In terms of the German major, um, what can I say about the German major? Well, so first of all, the German major, like all the language majors, obviously presupposes or creates a high level of language proficiency. So you basically take up to or have up to third year of German, and it doesn't translate very well to high school languages, as you probably know. I mean, I had a colleague the other day who said he took 7 years of Spanish in middle and high school. In middle school and high school, he took 7 years of Spanish. Then he came to Reed, and he did one semester of intro Spanish and was already miles ahead of where he'd been. I mean, that's a pretty typical story. So if you're in a third year language, you're already a pretty high level of proficiency in terms of being able to read and work and function in the language. So that's a sort of prerequisite for it. Most German majors will do at least a semester abroad at a German university. um, and do most of the coursework there in German, not exclusively. One thing I would say, just as an aside, is this is controversial in some circles, but as our study abroad programs have expanded, there are many, many opportunities to pretty much anywhere to also take courses in English. So, for example, like there are quite a lot of courses in Berlin in political science and government studies that are actually taught in English. So you have certain people, you can go to Berlin and take, literature courses in German, but you can also take poli sci in English. So that's not impossible at all. The other thing to remember is even if you're not a German major, you can go abroad for a semester or a year, take courses, and then they all transfer back and cover your major. So, you can take chem classes, you can take history, whatever. These things all transfer. They're all set up to do that. And the German major. Yeah, I think those are the main things. I mean, there are no required classes in the German major beyond the language sequence. There are no required classes in terms of what upper level courses you take. Now, there's not a huge offering of them, except when you go abroad. Then in Germany you have endless variety of things to choose from. Um, so I think that's yeah, I think that's the German major in terms of study abroad. Um, well, most comp lit students are going to be studying language anyway. So, for example, if you were majoring in comp lit, but you're interested in German, well, you'd be taking German so that you could do the upper level German lit courses. So you wouldn't be at any disadvantage when it came to studying abroad compared to somebody in the German department. You might be taking the very same language classes. So I mean, you could do, yeah, studying abroad, comp lit or German would, depending where you're going. Obviously, if you're in comp lit and you know German, but you want to go study abroad in France, I mean, that's a little bit, but then the other thing is there are quite a number of comp lit students who do have multiple languages. There are quite a number of students who've done theses that dealt in Spanish and French, for instance. Um, some of them just came in very strong in the one language. Some of them actually just learned both languages. They were just that interested. So it varies.
If you had to give advice to a prospective student, a recently admitted student that might be considering either of these programs, Complet or German, what advice would you give?
Advice about which one to do, or just advice? Oh,
Uh,
well, I guess, my advice actually to my advisees is always try things out and see. And there's no rush. So for example, if you came in, and I had a student this year who came in and said, I'm really interested in comp lit. She was a first year student. She's like, I think I want to take intro to comp lit. I said, great, take it. And you'll take that course and then you'll know, is this for me or not? If you're enthused, if you're excited, you'll know that's the way to go. If you realize, I think I'd rather actually be a Russian major, then you'll learn that too. But I always tell first year students, don't rush to judgment about any of these areas until you've actually tried them. And sometimes the results are sort of unfortunate. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I had a couple students who came in and they were interested in literature, but they also really wanted to do environmental studies. So they both started doing this environmental history course as first years, and they hated it. So they didn't pursue it. But it's really hard in advance until you're actually in the classes doing the reading, doing the discussions, writing the papers. It's very hard to predict. And so my advice always is try things out. Don't rule things out. And when a student says to me like, well, I think I want to major in this, but maybe I should try that. I'm always like, try something else. I mean, you have 4 years. There's no rush in a sense. You can decide one semester later. Go check out that sociology class you're interested in. Go check out that, whatever class. I think it's always much better that you sort of sample those things at the start, because a certain percentage of the time you'll discover, whoa, this is my passion, and then you can pursue it with a vengeance.
I love that, pursuing it with a vengeance. Um,
Here we go. Hold on, we have another question here.
yep.
Majors that heavily build around the question of this. Oh, minors. Okay, so minors are just coursework, and there aren't many restrictions on which courses. I mean, so if you want to do a German minor, you just do a certain number of German courses. You're totally free picking those. There's no restriction. So you don't. The only exception is there are independent studies. And those are more common actually in departments that have where well, it depends. I shouldn't say that. I mean, people do independent studies they do seem to do, for some reason, I don't know why, they seem to do a lot of them in Russian. I'm not sure why. Maybe the faculty are very generous with their time. But an independent study means like it sounds, you actually basically in conjunction with the faculty member agrees to teach something that's not on the books in a sense. And sometimes they'll do that with two or three students. So, for example, if there were two or three students who had very advanced abilities in something and it just wasn't there in the curriculum, the faculty might say, "Okay, we'll do an independent study." Um, but that's again, that's very ad hoc. That's not something you can count on. But minors, I should say, the minor is a really good thing. Like if you're coming to read and you have interest in literature, but you know in your heart of hearts you're really going to end up being a physics major, do a German minor, do a French minor, do a Spanish. The minors are great, and we didn't have them for a long time, but now that we do, it really does give you a lot of flexibility and it gives you some structure too. Um, what would the process senior student takes two majors? Okay, so basically, it is almost unheard of at Reed to really truly do two majors because you'd have to write two theses. And it's almost inconceivable to write them both at the same time, which would mean you would have to somehow write a senior thesis and then in next year write another senior. It's so it is very, very, very rare that someone would truly double major. What is much more common are interdisciplinary majors. And if you Google that, I mean, I could find you the list. Um, but Reed has a lot of what are called standing interdisciplinary majors. And what this means is, yeah, here we go. Sure, here I'll just put this link. You can see there's a whole host of them. And these are interdisciplinary majors that, have a certain are sort of formally structured. And here I was putting a link there. And that means you'd write one thesis, but you would probably have two advisors, one from each department. So for example, I'm just looking down this list here. Dance theater, you might write a thesis, you'd have an advisor from dance and an advisor from theater. History lit, you'd write one thesis, but you'd have an advisor from history and an advisor from lit, that kind of thing. And these programs, some of these programs, it varies, how this would work. Comp lit, of course, it's interdisciplinary, but you'd only have one advisor. But yeah, so it's much more common that people do interdisciplinary majors that you'd graduate, history lit or theater dance. It's very, very rare someone would write. And it's not never. I mean, I had a student who was in my introductory humanities courses first year, and then she ultimately wrote a senior thesis in poli sci and a senior thesis in Russian. She wrote two senior theses. I think she wrote them simultaneously. This was obviously an exceptionally dedicated and gifted person, but even then, I don't know if I would recommend it. It's I mean, it sounds cool, but somehow it's not. Anyway, um,
I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. We still have time, so feel free. Now's your, this is last call on the questions. I'm wondering, can you just tell us, well, what is your favorite part about being a part of the Read community?
well, the thing I always tell, and I was actually saying this today, I was interviewing somebody for a job at Reed. He must be a professor here. The thing I always tell people about Reed is, um, the students bring so much intensity and so much sort of intellectual energy to the table that it it's not just that it's a pleasure to teach them, but in some ways it's much easier. So I'm often asked by colleagues from other institutions, they'll say, "Oh, isn't it so tiring teaching a liberal arts college?" And I say to them, "Look, the most tiring kind of class to teach is when you go in and the students are totally uninterested and you're just pulling teeth, right? That's hard. Going into a class where everybody's totally engaged and excited, that's the easiest thing in the world." And Reed students, I think I mentioned earlier, I mean, they're very creative. And they have a certain kind of intellectual courage. And by that, I mean, they're not afraid to fail. They'll try things, they'll take risks. Not everybody, even some very gifted students, right, are not always willing to take risks and not have everything work out, but Reed students are. And it really, as I say, it makes it challenging to teach them because they always themselves want to be challenged. But it also, it's very exciting and it's humbling in a way. I once a week something happens in a seminar and I think to myself, wow, it's kind of amazing that this at this early in their intellectual careers they're already operating at such a high level. So I think that's, I think really, the best thing about Reed are the students in a certain way. It's kind of great. And then I should also say, a close second. I mean, the Reed faculty are truly extraordinarily dedicated teachers. To the point where, sometimes they'll sort of surprise themselves. I mean, I'm actually on the personnel committee that reviews people and promotes them and so forth. And sometimes you read some of these files and you just shake your head and wonder. These people are just, I mean, they're magicians. And it's hard to see, nobody can please everyone all the time, but some of these people can. And it's sometimes it's a wonder sometimes, how they do it. But so much care and so much wisdom goes into the pedagogy. So I think that's obviously a really exciting thing. There's a question here about the advisor letter. What kinds of things do students share? And how does that help you advise them? Are there specific things students write that are helpful? Um, that's actually a really good question. Um, I think the simple thing is in the letter, be honest. In other words, you don't need to impress the advisor. You're not trying to like look cool or something like that. Just tell them honestly, like, well, this is where I am. And sometimes it helps if you can explain why. So you might say, well, I think I might be interested in this major. Say why you think that. Maybe while I studied a class, or maybe because, one of my parents works in that area, or maybe because a friend told me it was cool. Just sort of be straightforward, like, why do you think you might want to be an anthro major or something like that? That can often help the advisor understand sort of where, well, I read this really cool book. That's why I want to be in this major. You sort of explain that kind of thing. That can often help the advisor understand like where you're coming from, what you think might be interesting about it, and so forth. But yeah, like I say, you don't need to bluff. You don't need to sort of, well, I know exactly what I want to do or something like that. That's not helpful. You're just beginning a conversation. And it's fine also, and probably not unusual at this stage. If you write that letter, send it in, and then a week later change your mind entirely, no one would blink. No one will bat an eye if you go into your advisory meeting and be like, "Oh yeah, everything I wrote is wrong. Here's what I think." That's perfectly normal. So
Wonderful. Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat box. So I think we can call it here. I hope this session was helpful. I hope you all got what you were hoping for out of this session and can tell you a little bit more about what you can expect out of the program, both programs, the Complet and German program here at Reed. Jan, thank you so much for your time this evening. I know it's after hours for you, so I appreciate you taking some time to chat with us and tell us a little bit more about these programs. For everyone else, thank you all so much for joining, and you all have a great rest of your day or evenings or wherever you are in the world.
all right, take care.
Thanks so much, everyone.